The autumn sun painted golden streaks across the marble floors of Suffolk County Courthouse as Judge James Rodriguez made his way through the security checkpoint. At precisely 7:45 a.m., just as he had done for the past 12 years, he nodded to Officer Martinez, who held the door open with practiced timing. "Another beautiful morning, Your Honor," Martinez said with his usual cheerful demeanor, though the weather report says we might get some unexpected storms later. James adjusted his perfectly pressed tie, barely acknowledging the warning. He'd never been one to let weather, or anything else, disrupt his meticulously planned schedule. His polished Oxford shoes clicked against the floor as he strode toward his chambers, the sound echoing through the still quiet halls. Maria Chen, his clerk of 8 years, was already at her desk outside his office, surrounded by stacks of case files. She stood quickly, her reading glasses slightly askew. "Good morning, Judge Rodriguez. I have today's docket ready, and there's something else." "Coffee first, Maria," he interrupted, pushing open his office door. "You know the routine." The morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the array of awards and certificates that lined his walls. James took a moment to straighten a slightly crooked frame, his Distinguished Service Award from the State Bar Association. Everything in his world had its place, its proper order. Maria followed him in, clutching her tablet. "Sir, there's been a memo from the State Administrative Office about." "Maria," he said, settling into his leather chair, "we have 23 cases to get through today. Unless the courthouse is burning down, everything else can wait until after my coffee." She hesitated, then nodded, retreating to fetch his usual morning brew. James opened his laptop, scanning through the day's cases. Mostly traffic violations, a few minor disputes, nothing he couldn't handle with his eyes closed. He'd earned his reputation as the strictest judge in the county, and he wore that distinction like a badge of honor. His coffee arrived exactly as he liked it, black, no sugar, in his favorite Yale Law mug. Maria hovered by his desk, still clearly anxious about whatever news she was trying to share. "All right," he conceded, taking a sip. "What's so urgent?" The State Administrative Office sent notice about a new Chief Justice of State Operations. They're conducting surprise inspections of local courts this month. James waved his hand dismissively. "Let them come. My courtroom runs like clockwork. Always has, always will." Maria bit her lip, about to say more, but was interrupted by a knock at the door. Bradley Thompson, the young prosecutor James had mentored since his appointment, poked his head in. "Judge Rodriguez, got a minute? There's an interesting case in today's lineup I'd like to discuss." James gestured for him to enter, already pulling up the docket on his screen. This was his element, the controlled, predictable flow of justice. He'd seen thousands of cases, heard every excuse, and prided himself on being able to read people instantly. His colleagues often joked that he could determine guilt just by the way someone tied their shoelaces. As Bradley began discussing the case details, James's mind wandered to the framed photo on his desk, himself shaking hands with the previous Chief Justice at last year's judicial conference. He'd been passed over for the position of District Chief Judge twice now, despite his impeccable record. Politics, they'd said. The need for diverse perspectives. The morning continued its usual rhythm. Case files reviewed, calendar confirmed, his robe pressed and ready. Everything in its place, every minute accounted for. But there was something in the air today, a slight disruption in the usual morning calm. Perhaps Officer Martinez had been right about those storms. Little did James Rodriguez know, the biggest storm of his career was about to walk through his courtroom doors, wearing a casual sweater and carrying a speeding ticket. Sophia Nakamura's morning had started with the kind of phone call everyone dreads. Her mother's caregiver's voice trembled on the other end of the line. "She fell, Ms. Nakamura. The ambulance is on its way to Boston General." The newly appointed Chief Justice of State Operations had been in the middle of reviewing court efficiency reports when the call came. Without a second thought, she grabbed her car keys and phone, leaving her blazer draped over her office chair. The morning had been unseasonably cool, and she'd worn her favorite cashmere sweater beneath it, hardly the attire she'd normally choose for a court appearance. Racing down Memorial Drive, her mind whirled with memories of her mother's recent decline. At 78, Keiko Nakamura had stubbornly insisted on maintaining her independence, despite her growing frailty. Sophia checked her rearview mirror just as red and blue lights flashed behind her. "Perfect," she muttered, pulling over beside the Charles River. The autumn leaves scattered across her windshield as Officer Kevin Murphy approached her silver Audi. "License and registration, ma'am," he said, his tone professional but firm. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Sophia took a deep breath. She could easily mention her position, show her judicial credentials, or make a quick call to the police commissioner. They played golf just last weekend. Instead, she handed over her documents. "I was speeding, Officer Murphy. I apologize. My mother's been taken to Boston General, and I'm trying to get there." The officer's expression softened slightly, but he continued writing the ticket. "I understand the emergency, ma'am, but you were doing 68 in a 45 zone. That's dangerous regardless of the circumstances." As she accepted the ticket, Sophia remembered her first day as Chief Justice just 3 weeks ago. She'd stood before the State Judiciary Board, promising to uphold equal justice and transparency at every level. "No one is above the law," she declared. Now, the universe was testing her commitment. Her phone buzzed. A text from the hospital. Her mother was stable, conscious, and asking for her. The tight knot in Sophia's chest loosened slightly. She looked at the ticket. Court date. Today at 2 p.m., Suffolk County Courthouse. Judge Rodriguez presiding. The morning's planned court inspections would have to wait. Instead, she faced the system from the other side, dressed in her weekend, casual attire rather than her usual power suits. The irony wasn't lost on her. At the hospital, Keiko greeted her daughter with characteristic stubbornness. "You didn't need to rush, Sophia-chan. Just a small slip." Her mother's casual dismissal of the fall belied the bruising visible on her arm. "Mom, we need to talk about having someone stay with you full-time," Sophia said, settling into the uncomfortable hospital chair. "After your court appearance," Keiko replied, gesturing to the ticket peeking out of Sophia's purse. "You've always taught young lawyers about experiencing the system from all perspectives. Now's your chance." Sophia smiled, remembering her early days as a public defender. Her mother had always found ways to turn every situation into a learning experience. By 1:45 p.m., Sophia sat on the hard wooden benches of Courtroom 3B. Around her, other citizens shifted nervously, clutching their tickets and rehearsing explanations. She observed the subtle dynamics at play. The court officer's bearing, the clerk's interactions, the subtle hierarchies visible in every gesture. A young man emerged from the courtroom shaking his head. "Don't bother explaining," he muttered to no one in particular. "Judge Rodriguez already has his mind made up before you open your mouth." Sophia straightened her sweater, tucking her long black hair behind her ears. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. Sometimes the best lessons come disguised as challenges. As the bailiff called the next case, she stood, smoothing her slacks and gathering her thoughts. She was about to get a very personal perspective on Suffolk County's judicial system. The fluorescent lights of Courtroom 3B cast harsh shadows across Judge Rodriguez's bench as he glanced at the next case file. His fingers drummed against the polished wood, a habit he'd developed over years of hearing excuses for traffic infractions. Next case, Nakamura Sophia. Speeding violation, 68 in a 45 zone, the bailiff announced. Sophia rose gracefully from her seat, her casual sweater standing out among the suits and formal attire typically seen in court. As she approached the podium, Maria Chen, the clerk, looked up with sudden recognition, her eyes widening slightly. She quickly busied herself with her computer screen. Judge Rodriguez didn't bother looking up from the file. "Ms. Nakamura, you were clocked at 23 miles over the posted limit on Memorial Drive. How do you plead?" "Your Honor, I acknowledge I was speeding," Sophia began, her voice clear and measured. "However, I'd like to explain the emergency circumstances." "A guilty plea, then," Rodriguez interrupted, his fingers already typing on his keyboard. The sharp clicks echoed through the hushed courtroom. Everyone has an emergency, Ms. Nakamura. That's why they're called speed limits, not speed suggestions. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the gallery. Maria shifted uncomfortably in her seat, trying to catch the judge's eye, but he remained focused on his screen. Your Honor, if I may, Sofia continued calmly, I received an urgent call about my elderly mother's fall and hospital admission. Rodriguez held up his hand. Ms. Nakamura, this court sees dozens of speeders daily. Each has a story. Each had somewhere important to be. His tone carried the weariness of someone who'd heard every possible excuse. The law exists precisely because everyone believes their emergency justifies breaking it. Sofia noticed Bradley Thompson, the young prosecutor, studying her with increasing interest. Perhaps he recognized her from legal circles, but he remained silent, watching the scene unfold. Your Honor, I respect the court's time, Sofia responded, maintaining her composure. I'm not seeking dismissal of the ticket. I merely wish to provide context for the record. The context, Ms. Nakamura, Rodriguez cut in, his voice sharp, is that you endangered others on the road. Your casual attitude about this violation is concerning. He gestured to her informal attire. This is a court of law, not a coffee shop. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Officer Martinez, standing by the door, frowned slightly at the judge's tone. Maria was now frantically typing something on her computer. Given your speed and apparent lack of regard for court decorum, Rodriguez continued, I'm imposing the maximum fine of $500. Additionally, I'm requiring attendance at a driver's safety course. He finally looked up, his expression stern. Perhaps that will encourage more responsible choices in the future. Sofia stood quietly for a moment, observing every detail of the scene. The judge's dismissive demeanor, the uncomfortable shifts of the court staff, the sympathetic glances from other defendants. She'd spent her career studying judicial conduct, but experiencing it firsthand was illuminating. Thank you, Your Honor, she said simply. Will that be all? Rodriguez had already moved on to the next file. You could pay the fine with the clerk. Next case. As Sofia turned to leave, Bradley Thompson stood abruptly, papers rustling in his hands. But before he could speak, she gave him a subtle shake of her head and walked toward Maria's desk. The clerk's hands trembled slightly as she processed the payment. Ms. Naka, I mean your Han, she whispered. Just Ms. Nakamura today, Sofia replied quietly, signing the receipt. Thank you, Maria. She gathered her belongings and walked out of the courtroom, already composing a mental list of observations. Behind her, the daily procession of cases continued, each receiving Judge Rodriguez's particular brand of justice. Tomorrow would be interesting indeed. Back in her private chambers at the State Judicial Center, Sofia sat before 3 computer screens, her half-eaten lunch forgotten beside her keyboard. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across her desk as she dove deeper into Judge Rodriguez's case history. Ms. Nakamura, her assistant, Thomas Kim, knocked gently on the doorframe. Your mother's nurse called. Everything's fine, but she's asking when you'll visit again. Sofia smiled, grateful for the update. Thank you, Thomas. I'll stop by this evening. She gestured to the screens before her. First, I need your help with something. Can you pull the last 5 years of Judge Rodriguez's case files? Thomas raised an eyebrow, but knew better than to ask questions. Within minutes, he returned with a tablet containing the digital archives. I've also included the courthouse staff turnover rates and appeals data you requested. The numbers began telling a story as Sofia analyzed the patterns. Judge Rodriguez's courtroom had the highest fine rates in the county, but that wasn't what caught her attention. It was the subtle variations in sentencing that painted a more complex picture. Her phone buzzed. A text from Bradley Thompson, the young prosecutor from earlier. Didn't realize it was you today. Should have spoken up. Can we talk? Not yet, she typed back. Continue as normal tomorrow. Sofia pulled up the courthouse security footage from the past month, something few knew the Chief Justice could access. She watched Rodriguez's interactions. Curt with some defendants, lenient with others. The pattern wasn't immediately obvious. That's why it had gone unnoticed for so long. Thomas, she called out. Can you get me Judge Rodriguez's clerk on the phone? Maria Chen. Minutes later, Maria's nervous voice came through the speaker. Chief Justice Nakamura, I'm so sorry about today. I tried to warn him. Maria, Sophia interrupted gently. You're not in any trouble. I need your help understanding something. Would you be comfortable meeting me for coffee? Off the record. An hour later, they sat in a quiet corner of a small cafe 2 blocks from the courthouse. Maria's hands wrapped tightly around her cup as she spoke. He's not a bad person, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. But over the years, I've noticed patterns. The way he speaks to certain defendants, the assumptions he makes before they even open their mouths. Sophia nodded, taking notes on her phone. Has anyone ever filed formal complaints? Maria shook her head. Most people don't bother. They pay their fines and leave. The few who appeal usually give up when they see the cost and time involved. Back in her office, Sophia created a detailed spreadsheet. The data revealed subtle but consistent disparities in fine amounts, speaking time allowed to defendants, and frequency of maximum penalties. Nothing obviously discriminatory. Rodriguez was too smart for that, but the cumulative effect was undeniable. Her desk phone lit up. Chief Justice, her secretary announced. Judge Martinez from the appeals court is on line 1. He says it's about Judge Rodriguez. Tell them I'll call back tomorrow, Sophie replied, still focused on her analysis. The pieces were falling into place, revealing a pattern of subtle bias that had likely gone unchecked for years. As evening approached, she gathered her findings into a preliminary report. Tomorrow's meeting would need to be handled delicately. This wasn't about public humiliation or revenge, but about addressing systemic issues that affected real lives. Sophia closed her laptop and gathered her things, her mind already mapping out tomorrow's conversation. As she passed the courthouse on her way to the hospital, she noticed Judge Rodriguez's office light still on, his silhouette visible through the window. He had no idea that his carefully constructed world was about to change. Time for some evening reflection, she murmured to herself, watching him move about his office. Tomorrow will give you plenty to think about, James Rodriguez. Judge Rodriguez strode through the courthouse's executive floor, his shoes clicking against the polished marble. He checked his watch. 8:55 a.m., 5 minutes early for the quarterly judicial review meeting. Perfect timing, as always. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the portraits of past Chief Justices lining the hallway. Rodriguez had memorized every face during his countless walks to these meetings, imagining his own portrait among them someday. Good morning, Your Honor, called out Thomas Kim, arranging papers at his desk outside the main conference room. They're waiting for you inside. Rodriguez paused. I thought this was a standard review with Administrator Phillips. There have been some changes to the schedule, Thomas replied carefully, not meeting his eyes. Would you like some coffee before you go in? No, thank you, Rodriguez answered, straightening his tie. Changes to his schedule always irritated him, but he wouldn't let it show. He reached for the conference room door, noting the unusual quiet from within. The first thing he noticed was the empty chair at the far end of the table, Philip's usual seat. The second was the steaming cup of coffee placed at the head of the table, next to a familiar cashmere sweater draped over the chair's back. Good morning, Judge Rodriguez, came a voice from behind him. Please have a seat. He turned to find Sophia Nakamura standing by the window, dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, her Chief Justice badge gleaming on her lapel. His coffee cup trembled slightly as recognition dawned. Ms. Naka. He started, then corrected himself. Chief Justice Nakamura. The same Ms. Nakamura from yesterday's traffic court, she confirmed, moving to take her seat at the head of the table. Though I was dressed more casually then. Please, sit. Rodriguez lowered himself into a chair, his mind racing through yesterday's interaction. Every dismissive word, every interruption, every condescending gesture now played back in vivid detail. I apologize for the unconventional approach, Sophia continued, opening a leather portfolio. But sometimes the best insights come from unexpected perspectives. You could have identified yourself, Rodriguez managed, his collar suddenly feeling too tight. And missed the opportunity to experience your courtroom as ordinary citizens do. She raised an eyebrow. That would have defeated the purpose of my evaluation. Maria Chen entered quietly, distributing folders to both of them. Rodriguez noticed his clerk couldn't quite meet his eyes. I've been conducting reviews across the state, Sophie explained, her tone professional but firm. Yesterday's experience was illuminating. But let's look at the broader picture. She pressed a button and a screen descended from the ceiling. Graphs and charts appeared, displaying years of courtroom data. Rodriguez recognized his case numbers, but not the patterns they revealed. Your Honor, Sophie continued, your dedication to the law is evident. Your punctuality, case management, and courtroom efficiency are exemplary. She paused, letting the praise settle. However, justice requires more than efficiency. Rodriguez shifted in his seat, his usual confidence wavering. Chief Justice, if this is about yesterday's case, this is about patterns, Judge Rodriguez. Patterns that became personal for me yesterday. She turned to face him fully. Tell me, what made you assume I wasn't taking the court seriously? Was it my casual attire? My attempt to explain circumstances? Or perhaps something else? The question hung in the air between them. Through the window, clouds passed over the sun, dimming the room momentarily. Rodriguez looked down at his trembling coffee cup, seeing his reflection distorted in the dark liquid. I believe, Sophia said softly, we have much to discuss about the future of justice in Suffolk County. Sophia's corner office commanded a breathtaking view of Boston Harbor, but Judge Rodriguez barely noticed the sailboats dotting the water below. His attention was fixed on the wall of screens before him, each displaying different aspects of his 12-year judicial record. Let's start with something positive, Sophia began, gesturing to a graph. Your case clearance rate is impressive. Cases move through your courtroom efficiently, and your documentation is meticulous. Rodriguez straightened in his chair, grasping at this small comfort. I've always believed that justice delayed is justice denied. Indeed. Sophia tapped her tablet, bringing up new data. But speed isn't everything. Look at these numbers from the past 3 years. The screens filled with comparative analyses, fine amounts, sentencing patterns, speaking time allotted to defendants. Subtle variations emerged, painting a picture Rodriguez had never noticed, or perhaps had chosen not to see. I maintain strict standards for everyone, he defended, but his voice lacked its usual certainty. Do you? Sophia pulled up video clips from courthouse security cameras. Watch your body language here and here. She played incidents from different cases, showing his subtle shifts in posture, tone, and attention level with different defendants. Rodriguez watched himself on screen, seeing his behavior through new eyes. His stomach tightened as patterns became apparent, patterns he'd never acknowledged, even to himself. Your Honor, Sophia said softly, yesterday wasn't just about a speeding ticket. When I entered your courtroom in casual clothes, you made assumptions. You saw what you expected to see, and you acted on those expectations. Chief Justice Nakamura, I. Sophia, please. She raised her hand. This isn't an inquisition, James. It's a conversation that's long overdue. She moved to a small coffee station in the corner, pouring 2 cups. The aroma of fresh espresso filled the room as she handed him one. Tell me, what did you see when I walked into your courtroom yesterday? Rodriguez stared into his coffee, remembering. Someone who didn't respect the court enough to dress properly. Someone who thought rules didn't apply to them. And if I'd walked in wearing this suit? The question hung in the air as Rodriguez considered the implications. The harbor breeze rattled the windows gently, filling the thoughtful silence. I've seen the appeals data, Sophie continued. Most people don't challenge your rulings. They can't afford the time or money, but their experiences shape their trust in our justice system. She brought up another screen showing letters and emails from past defendants. Stories of financial hardship from excessive fines, lost job opportunities, families struggling to recover from the cascading effects of strict penalties. The law is the law, Rodriguez insisted, but with less conviction than before. True, Sophie agreed, But justice requires wisdom in its application. Your position gives you tremendous discretionary power. The question is, how are you using it? She showed him more data. Statistics on fine amounts correlated with defendants' names, appearances, and neighborhoods. The patterns were subtle but undeniable. Rodriguez began, then stopped. He thought of his own father, an immigrant who'd faced countless subtle prejudices while building a life in Boston. I never intended this. Few do, Sophie replied. That's why these conversations are so important. She set down her coffee cup and leaned forward. James, you're an excellent judge in many ways. Your dedication to the law is admirable. But excellence isn't just about following rules. It's about understanding their impact on real lives. Outside, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting warm light across the office. Rodriguez watched a seabird soar past the window, remembering all the times he dismissed explanations, rushed through hearings, made snap judgments based on appearances. What happens now? He asked quietly. Sophia smiled, pulling out a new folder. Now we talk about moving forward. I have some ideas I'd like to discuss. The next few weeks brought subtle but significant changes to Courtroom 3B. Judge Rodriguez's leather-bound notebook, once filled with briefcase notes, now contained detailed observations of his own behavior and reactions. Today's entry read, "Caught myself interrupting again. Stopped. Listened. Story changed everything." He looked up from his writing as Maria Chen entered his chambers, carrying the afternoon's case files. The usual tension in her shoulders had eased over the past weeks, replaced by a cautious optimism. "Your Honor, Mr. Parker's case is first this afternoon," she said, placing the files on his desk. "It's about his third parking violation." "Tell me about Mr. Parker," Rodriguez asked, a new routine they'd developed. Before, he would have simply read the violation and fine history. "He's a night shift nurse at Boston General," Maria shared, surprised but pleased by the continued interest in context. "His assigned parking space is under construction, and the hospital's temporary lot is often full." Rodriguez nodded, making notes. A month ago, he would have seen only the repeated violations, not the healthcare worker struggling with infrastructure issues. During the afternoon session, the changes were subtle but noticeable. Rodriguez still maintained order in his courtroom, but his interactions had shifted. He listened more, spoke less, and considered context before judgment. "Mr. Parker," he addressed the tired-looking nurse in scrubs, "I understand the parking situation at the hospital is challenging." The young nurse stood straighter, clearly having expected immediate condemnation. "Yes, Your Honor. I've been trying to arrive earlier to find legal spots, but during emergencies." Rodriguez remembered Sophia's words about impact on real lives. "The law serves the community," he said, "and our healthcare workers are essential to that community. Instead of a fine, I'm ordering you to work with the hospital administration to document this parking issue. Report back in 30 days. During a brief recess, Bradley Thompson approached the bench. "Different approach today, Your Honor," the young prosecutor observed. "Justice wears many faces, Mr. Thompson," Rodriguez replied, surprising himself with the words. "Sometimes we need to look closer to see them all." Later that afternoon, Rodriguez did something he'd never done before. He walked through the courthouse parking lot, observing the challenges that brought so many violations to his courtroom. He noticed the confusing signage, the limited handicap spaces, the difficult angles. His phone buzzed, a message from Sophia. "How's the journey going?" He typed back, "Learning to see what I used to overlook." That evening, instead of heading straight home, Rodriguez stopped at Joe's Diner, where many courthouse employees ate lunch. He passed it for years but never entered. The cashier, an elderly Asian woman, reminded him of the grandmother he rarely visited during law school. "First time here?" she asked warmly. "You're the judge, right? My grandson had a traffic ticket in your court last year." Rodriguez felt a moment of unease, but she was smiling. "You were strict but fair," she continued. He learned his lesson, that one. Drives like a turtle now. Over coffee and apple pie, Rodriguez observed the diverse mix of people: courthouse staff, lawyers, defendants, and families, all sharing the same space, all part of the community he served. Back home, he opened his laptop to review the next day's cases. But instead of just reading violations and ordinances, he found himself wondering about the stories behind each name. His judicial oath hung framed on his study wall. To do right to all manner of people. All manner of people, he whispered, really seeing those words for the first time in years. His phone buzzed again, a calendar reminder for tomorrow. 9 a.m. Meeting with Court Community Outreach Committee. A month ago, he would have delegated this to a junior judge. Now he was actually looking forward to it. In his journal, he added one final note for the day. Justice isn't just about what the law says. It's about who the law serves. 3 months later, Sophia sat quietly in the back of Courtroom 3B, observing the afternoon session. The physical space remained unchanged. Same polished wood, same fluorescent lights, same American flag beside the bench. But the atmosphere had shifted noticeably. A young woman stood before Judge Rodriguez, explaining her situation in halting English. 3 months ago, he might have impatiently called for a translator. Today, he listened patiently as she found her words, nodding encouragingly. "Ms. Lin," he said when she finished, "thank you for explaining your circumstances. Would you feel more comfortable continuing in Mandarin? Maria can translate." Maria Chen smiled slightly as she moved to assist. The clerk's relationship with the judge had evolved from tense deference to respectful collaboration. The change hadn't gone unnoticed. Courthouse staff now referred to 3B as the listening courtroom. Rodriguez worked through his cases with the same efficiency as before, but his rulings now carried something new: understanding. When an elderly veteran appeared for a zoning violation regarding his home business, Rodriguez didn't just quote ordinances. He asked questions about the man's needs and worked with the city representative to find a solution. During a brief recess, Bradley Thompson approached Sophia's observation seat. "Quite a change from 3 months ago," the young prosecutor remarked quietly. "How so?" Sophia asked, though she'd been noting the differences herself. "He's still strict, still runs a tight courtroom," Bradley explained. "But now he sees people, not just cases. Last week, he helped establish a pro bono legal clinic for the community." The afternoon session continued. Rodriguez handled each case with careful attention, but one interaction particularly caught Sophia's eye. A teenage driver, cited for speeding, stood nervously before the bench. "Young man," Rodriguez began, and Sophia noticed him glance briefly at her seat before continuing. "The speed limit on Memorial Drive exists for everyone's safety. However, I see this as your first offense, and you've brought letters from your teachers about your volunteer work." The teenager nodded, clutching his paperwork. "Instead of fine," Rodriguez continued, "I'm sentencing you to 6 hours of ride-along with our traffic division. See that speed limit from the other side. Additionally, channel that volunteer spirit into our courthouse youth program. Your perspective could be valuable." As the session ended, Sophia watched Rodriguez chat briefly with the courthouse staff, something she'd never seen him do before. He knew their names now, asked about their families. The hierarchy remained, but the human connection had grown. In his chambers afterward, Rodriguez looked up as Sophia entered. "Chief Justice," he greeted her warmly. "I trust your observations were interesting." "Very," she replied, taking a seat. "I particularly noticed the Lin case. Your handling of the language barrier was impressive." "I've been taking Mandarin lessons," he admitted. "Twice a week. My instructor says my pronunciation is terrible, but I'm learning." Sophie raised an eyebrow, pleasantly surprised. "That's commitment." "I had a good wake-up call," he said, glancing meaningfully at her. Then he reached for a folder on his desk. "Actually, I'd like your opinion on something. I've been developing a proposal for modernizing our community outreach programs." As they discussed the proposal, Sophia noticed the changes in his office too. New photos showed Rodriguez at community events, talking with local leaders, engaging with the public he served. His prestigious awards still hung on the walls, but they've been joined by children's artwork from the courthouse daycare center. You know, Rodriguez said as their meeting concluded, I used to think justice was about being right. Now I understand it's about getting it right. Sophia stood to leave, then paused. One more thing, James. There's an opening for the district chief judge position next month. I hope you'll consider applying. Actually, he replied thoughtfully, I'm more interested in continuing my work here. Real change happens one case at a time, in rooms like 3B. As she left the courthouse, Sophia noticed the new sign in the parking lot, reserved for courthouse visitors. Welcome to your house of justice. Small changes adding up to something bigger. Just like one speeding ticket on a sunny autumn day.